I'm Rob Dawson. We've got Mark Ogden back in the studio, but we've lost James. James is in Eindhoven ahead of Arsenal's Champions League trip. James, Eindhoven treating you well so far?
Yeah, all good. Nice reminder of the realities of European travel these days on arrival here. Actually, we were in two queues for the passport control. One was EU passports, one was non-EU, and this British guy goes right up to the EU passport. Is told he's got to go to join the other queue, and the Dutch passport control officer just looked him right in the eyes when he said, "Well, why? I've just queued for 10 minutes to get here." And he said, "Because you voted for Brexit." And I was like, "Yeah, well, that's where we are." So.
See, it's not as glamorous as you think, is it, all this football travel? We're going to start today then with Man United's finances. Mark, you've written a piece that's going up on ESPN.com this week about the importance of United's Europa League tie against Real Sociedad. I think in your intro, you've called it the most important game or the most impactful game potentially since 1990. You're going to have to explain that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously United have been to 4 Champions League finals since then. Won 2, lost 2. They've won countless Premier League titles, FA Cups, but for me, this is the most consequential game for United since Sir Alex Ferguson went to Nottingham Forest with his team in January 1990, needing to win to save his job. And people might think that's a bit over the top, bit of hyperbole, but the situation is if Man United don't win the Europa League this season, which gives them a route back into the Champions League, they are facing a shortfall of at least £100 million next season. And that's, at the moment, with the situation the club are in, considering their losses, their job cutting, their desperate need to strengthen the squad, to be £100 million down before they even start next season, that could put United back for 5 or 6 years. So that's why, for me, this game and every Europa League game which follows between now and the end of the season to the final in Bilbao is the most important game for 35 years. And if they don't win the Europa League, I mean, that is the only route to Europe now. They can't get into Europe via the FA Cup, they're knocked out. They can't get in via the league because they're so far adrift. So they have to win the Europa League, which has what is the golden ticket of a pass to the Champions League. So it's a real tightrope, and if they win it, amazing, that gets them. It's like snakes and ladders. It's the kind of ladder right back up to where they need to be, or close to. But if they don't win it, the reality is that United have got to rebuild the squad, change the club with a lot less money coming in.
I mean, United have been quite keen, haven't they, to kind of tell fans that they've lost 300 million over the last 3 years, that's impacted their PSR, that they're so close to breaching PSR that it's hampering what they can invest in players and the squad. It's obviously hampering what Ruben Amorim can do. He's only a couple of months into the job. I know it's a very complicated topic, but can you just assess that the scale of the problems at Man United for a casual listener maybe who doesn't understand what kind of financial mess United are in at the moment?
Yeah, first of all, let me just explain the breakdown of my £100 million black hole. So being in Europe is worth to United around about £50 million from just being in Europe. That's the Europa League. If they're in the Europa League, they can earn about £50 million. And that includes gate receipts, because every time United play at Old Trafford, it's worth £4 to £5 million in gate receipts. If they're in the Champions League with the way it's going now, you're looking at about £80 million basic that a club will earn. So £80 million down, 4 games, that's £20 million for the games. If they're not in the Champions League, then they're looking at another £20, £25 million drop on their earnings from Adidas. So already it's mounting to over £100 million. So even if they can't be in the Europa League now, but even if they were back in the Europa League, if they can account the Europa League money, it's still a massive hole. Add to the fact that every Premier League position is worth around £3.5 million. United are going to finish maybe 8, 9, 10 places below where they finished last season, which means they could be looking at a £30, £35 million shortfall there. So the situation they're in right now, we saw the Q2 or the quarterly figures recently. They were pretty bad. They highlighted a drop in revenue. And just to explain how important it is to be in Europe, Liverpool announced their losses or the annual figures last week, and their losses were £57 million. Now the bulk of that, the vast majority, was because they weren't in the Champions League last season. So it's a massive, massive revenue stream for the big clubs, and that's why a lot of these clubs, Arsenal reported losses recently. Liverpool reported losses. Aston Villa are operating at the moment with 96% of their wage bill of their turnover. So that is a huge financial commitment. But if you're in the Champions League, you're okay. If you're not in the Champions League, as United haven't been and probably won't be unless they win the Europa League, then they have to service a huge wage bill, and that's what they can't do.
I mean, just in terms of United are facing issues that other clubs aren't, particularly the Glazer debt, the leverage buyout from 2005, because I mentioned that £300 million that they've lost over the last 3 years. It's estimated that around 200 million of that is interest payments alone on Glazer debt. So it's obviously a problem that's only affects Man United. But in terms of what the Champions League and the Europa League and qualification can do for other clubs, James, I mean, you've seen that firsthand with Arsenal and Tottenham. You know, the importance of qualifying for those competitions, the extra revenue it generates, what happens then with in terms of what you can invest in the squad and maintaining that level in the Premier League.
Yeah, I think Arsenal are probably the most obvious comparison here in that, you know, they were Champions League mainstays for a number of years. I know that it's sort of the back end of the Wenger era. They started to budget in 4-year cycles, and they worked on the basis that 3 out of every 4 years they would be in the Champions League. So that's how they sort of controlled their spending, and they gave themselves a little bit of a safety net. But of course, the problem was they started to fail to qualify for the Champions League every year. It became 6 years. And, you know, a lot of that obviously coincided that period with COVID as well. I mean, it's easy to forget perhaps that, you know, Arsenal were one of the first clubs to lay off staff. I know there's obviously a lot of focus on Ineos and doing that now, but I mean, Arsenal, I think it was 55 non-playing staff they made redundant. They asked the players to take a 15% wage cut. The directors did the same. You know, and a lot of that was obviously the COVID impact was huge, but a lot of that was also because, of course, they didn't have the Champions League revenue and hadn't had it for a number of years, and could see, you know, financial fair play rules tightening, and you know, and the revenue streams sort of struggling to reach what they had before. So there is a real warning there for United that, you know, obviously what Arsenal were able to do. And it's why Mikel Arteta gets a kind of an easier ride than perhaps other managers would now, is that he was able to turn that situation around. You know, the bravery that they showed, that maybe Man United now need to show in paying off the players that they don't want to be there. You know, they paid off, I think it was 9, they ripped up 9 players' contracts, and they weren't cheap. You know, Mesut Ozil, I think, got something like 7 million quid out of the club to rip up his contract and get rid of him because they felt the culture of the club was wrong. You know, and they did that with a number of other players, Skodran Mustafi, Socrates, of course, Aubameyang, before he went to Barcelona. So that was a massive financial risk for Arsenal at the time, but they felt that they needed this reset to get the club right. And it just feels as though what Ineos are doing at the moment is targeting the easier wins, which is the non-playing staff, the people who don't have the profile, you know, the behind-the-scenes characters, rather than the main players who really have proven over a long period of time that they are not good enough. And if you're going to back Ruben Amorim, the best way to do that is to get rid of the players he doesn't want, and to do it quickly, because the longer that they're there, the more this situation is going to fester.
The problem with that, though, that United have got, is that they're so close to the ceiling on PSR that if they did that, so it was explained to me last week. So if you take Casemiro, for example, he's got a year left on his contract. So he was signed for Real Madrid 2022, I think, on a 4-year contract. So on the books, he's worth £15 million to United next season. So if United were to cancel Casemiro's contract to get off the wage bill, they would have a £15 million loss on their accounts because he's still worth £15 million. So what United have to do with Casemiro is try and find somebody that will pay at least £15 million to write off that loss. And so it's not a loss, it balances the books, and then get his wages off the bill. Now, who is going to pay £15 million for Casemiro as well as pay his wages? It's not going to happen. Marcus Rashford is another situation whereby, you know, again, United want Rashford out of the club, but he's on £325,000 a week with 3 more years left on that contract. There's a suggestion that he's worth around £40 million. That, you know, Aston Villa might pay that. Now, if you can sell Rashford at £40 million, that's pure profit on the books. But Marcus Rashford is not going to take a pay cut, I wouldn't have thought, to go to Aston Villa. Aston Villa can't afford to pay him twice what their top earners on. So United are either going to have to subsidise Marcus Rashford's move away by paying half of his wages or paying him to go. So again, there's no easy way out. So, you know, Arsenal maybe did that just before PSR started to bite, but I think United have now backed themselves into such a corner that they can't do it. And, you know, that's just 2 players. Mason Mount never plays. Luke Shaw never plays. They're on contracts that ideally the club would move them on because they're not earning those contracts. But it's, again, one, you've got to find people to take them on, and you've got to find people to take them on at the worth on the club's books, which is just unrealistic because, you know, the Casemiro one is the big one. Anthony's another one. You know, Anthony was signed for £85 million 3 years ago. Again, you know, you're looking at maybe £30 million on the books. Nobody's going to pay £30 million for Anthony. So United ideally would get rid of all these players, but they can't do it because they will just go straight into infringing PSR rules.
I mean, there are 3 main reasons, aren't there, really, why United are in this position. One is the Glazer debt, the amount of money it takes to service that debt, I think must have come out recently, said it takes around £3 million.
It's about £35 million a year.
£3 million a month or something to service that debt. Sorry. On top of that, you've got a net spend, which is over the last 10 years is comparable to the likes of Man City. But there have been so many poor decisions made that there has been no success from that money spent. I mean, I think in the last fiscal year alone, it's more than £200 million on players that were signed initially for Erik ten Hag, a man that you went and sacked 3 years ago. And then the performances on the pitch, that in the last sort of 10 years, I think they qualified for the Champions League, 6 times? In the last 10 years, they've won one Champions League knockout game, which is incredible for a team which, in the latter years of Sir Alex Ferguson, won it in 2008, reached the final in 2010, and 2009 and 2011. And the drop-off in terms of performance off the pitch, performance on the pitch, is so stark that you're almost seeing in front of your eyes a team that was at the very, very top of European football becoming a mid-table team, a perennial mid-table team.
Yeah, and just within that spend you talk about, United owe over £300 million on outstanding transfer payments. Now, I have to explain that is a big figure for United, obviously, but that is not unusual. Arsenal, Liverpool, Chelsea, they all have big kind of payments to settle on players that they have signed over the years. Basically, if a player signs for a club on a 4-year contract, the payment is paid over the 4 years, so it's not unusual for what's happened with United. But the situation United is, other clubs have sold players and kind of balancing the book. Their net kind of outlay isn't as big as United, so they've got that problem to address. But, you're right, all these financial problems mount up. It's like United have been on a spending spree on a credit card, and they've bought all this useless stuff they don't need, all these kind of high-end items that are no use to anybody anymore. They can't get rid of them. And they've got to pay for it. 3 or 4 years down the line, they've got to pay for all these extravagant spending that they had 3 or 4 years ago. And unfortunately for Ruben Amorim, he's inheriting the lavish spending of the Ten Hag regime and even the Solskjaer regime. He's got to unpick all that. And, the question mark is, and I know we're going to address this, is he going to get to the point where he can do that? It feels like he's in a race right now with the players he wants to get rid of. Who's going to last the longest?
Before we do that then, James, I think sometimes me and Mark are obviously based in Manchester. We get caught up sometimes in the whirlwind that comes with Man United. You're a bit more removed from that. Do you still see Man United as a kind of major Premier League player? In the way that Arsenal have made themselves title challengers in the last few years, is the view outside Manchester that United are still one of the top teams, or is it the kind of looking at them as a team that have kind of slipped away and we don't have to worry about them anymore because they're so far adrift of everything?
I think that the most damning aspect is that, you talk to the clubs that I sort of primarily cover, being Arsenal, Chelsea and Tottenham, and those clubs, would fear a trip to Old Trafford. They don't anymore. They don't. They expect to win there. They expect to beat that team home and away now. Obviously the history, and probably the older you are, the more revered Manchester United are in your own mind. But there's a generation of fans now who are coming through who don't really remember the Fergie era particularly well. They only know the last decade that's been mismanagement on an unbelievable scale. And I think, there's reverence for the size of the club and the history and, and the size of the stadium and everything that comes with that. But I don't think there's anything like the sense of trepidation that there used to be for those teams when they go and play Man United. And I do think, I know we've talked a lot about Ineos, rightly, but the Glazers, my understanding, and you guys correct me on this, but I think the Glazers have taken £1 billion out of that club in total to service the debt. There is no way that football authorities, respectable, responsible football authorities, should allow that to happen. And there's a lot of talk in this country now about the independent regulator and the powers that regulator will have to control the buying and selling of football clubs going forward. I don't think they're going to ban leverage buyouts. It doesn't sound like that's something that's on the agenda, but it really should be. Because if I buy a house and I need a mortgage on that house, then I am means tested and I'm given a maximum limit I can borrow. It's the same if I want to buy a nice car, anything else. There is no way in this world that the Glazers should have been allowed to complete that takeover in the first place and borrow the amount of money that they have. Because there are only probably one or two clubs in the world that could have £1 billion taken out of them over 20 years and still be functioning. The fact, when you look at it in that context, that United are still standing is a testament to how big that club was before they took them over. And I know there's an argument about the Glazers have added commercial value and off the field, they've had their assets that have improved the size and the scale of the club over a period of time. But you cannot say to me that it can be acceptable. And the Premier League is the biggest league in the world. It should be more regulated than it is now, because you cannot allow a situation where owners who effectively do not have the money or do not want to put the money in to run a club effectively can be allowed to complete that takeover. It's just a warning for everybody that this should not be allowed to happen in future.
I mean, the point you make there about how a club can still function, that's right. And I think just to your point, Rob, about are people still worried about Man United or scared, that the one positive I can bring out of this for fans is that people are still respectful of Man United or aware of what a club they are, because the recent Deloitte Money League was published in January, and Man United are fourth in terms of revenue generated. So despite all the problems they've got, only 3 clubs in the world make more money per year than Man United, and 2 of those are Man City and PSG. Now they have revenue streams that Man United and other clubs can't tap into. Real Madrid at the top, but Man United are the 4th biggest generating club in the world, despite all the terrible results and performances over the last 10 years. So that shows that if or when, they will get it right eventually, somebody will. When United get it right, they're a juggernaut, and they're a juggernaut that will take a lot of stopping, but the problem is the juggernaut's going the wrong way, it takes a lot of stopping as well. So that's where United are. They're a juggernaut going down a hill with no brakes at the moment, and it's a worry as to where it's going to stop. But if they get it right, this is a club that's got a massive fan base, it's got massive commercial appeal, it's got a great history. So all the positives are there. The negatives right now are the people that are running the club and the people that, are trying to exploit the club for what it is, and to, for the Glazers, as we know, it's like a cash machine. It has been for so many years because of the money they've taken out of it.
You've spoken there about the financial impact possibly of that Real Sociedad game. We'll move on to what it might mean for Ruben Amorim. Now, I spoke to people at United before the Fulham game, and they've been really, really keen to stress that they're very committed to Amorim. They're not going to make knee-jerk reactions. They know that it's not been great on the pitch, but he's only a couple of months in. Gradually, as it kind of approached that Fulham game, they were kind of accepting that the cup competitions this season were really important. A, because it prolongs the season, it gives United something to play for into sort of April and May, but also because it is a pathway into Europe. The FA Cup gets you into Europe. Obviously, winning the Europa League gets you into the Champions League. Obviously, now they've been knocked out of the FA Cup. Ruben Amorim is facing that game against Real Sociedad, probably the toughest tie that they could have got. They could have been given. What happens to Ruben Amorim, or what happens to the pressure around him if they don't win that tie and they get knocked out?
Well, the pressure, I'd imagine, will primarily come from us, the media. I think because that is the way it is. If Man United lose and the manager gets questions asked of him, so internally, I'm not hearing a lot of heat right now on Amorim, because it's, the decision was made by Ineos. It's their guy, so if they admit that they've made another mistake, having made the mistake with Dan Ashworth, it looks like they're incompetent, and so they don't really look like they're incompetent, even though they might be. The fans, generally, I think that the big majority are behind Amorim, because I think they see him doing what they want a manager to do, and in many ways, he's the one person at the club hasn't let them down yet. Yeah. The owners have let them down. Ineos have let them down. Certainly, judging by the chants towards Jim Ratcliffe at the weekend, that they're not a fan of Jim Ratcliffe, and the players have let them down repeatedly. So they see Amorim as basically being the first coach that's gone in there with a real idea of what he wants to do and how to do it. But the problem is, he's relying on players who aren't good enough, who know they haven't got a future there, to get him to the summer. And it's almost like a race between players who aren't good enough, who know that their time's up, and Amorim to see who can survive the longest. And it has to be Amorim, because if they get to the summer and the club decide that, there's no guarantee it's going to get better between then and the end of the season. You look at the fixture list, United might finish 15th, 16th. They might not climb the table. So by the time you get to the summer, you've got a manager who's so wedded to this formation to the point where it's becoming a problem for him now, because he's so stubborn with it. But if he went the other way, if he said, right, okay, we'll go to 4-3-3 or 4-4-2 and see how it goes, and they start winning some games, then how does he get his credibility back in the summer when he says, right, lads, I want to go back to 3 at the back now? Oh, it didn't work last season. So he's backed himself into a corner. If they get into that situation where Ineos thinking his system isn't working, the players aren't improving, do we really want to buy new players to fit his system and then risk 6 months' time having to sack him with a load of players that aren't suitable for the next manager? So,
and that's my concern, because if you make the decision to hire Amorim post-season, knowing full well he's going to come in and play 3-4-3. You have to see it out to the end of the season, and you have to get to the summer and back him wholeheartedly, because there's no point otherwise. The concern is that the start has been so poor, and you're right. I can't really see it picking up between now and the end of the season. Because if the players were going to get the system, they would have done it by now, and he hasn't got the players. He hasn't got the players. Just in attacking positions, he hasn't got the players, and the players he has got aren't good enough. So it's not going to pick up, I wouldn't have thought, between now and the end of the season. And then Ineos get caught in this kind of halfway house, where you get to the summer, you need to spend money on new players, but you're not 100% sure that Amrim is the guy.
Money they haven't got.
And you're not 100% sure Amrim is the guy. So you kind of say, well, we're not going to give you all the players you want, because we're not sure whether we're going to still be playing this system in 3 months. So we're going to give you a couple of club signings that you're going to have to work with, and a couple of your guys. And Amrim is sat there at the start of the season going, this isn't what I asked for. And he's still in the same mess as he was in sort of January and February. I mean, James, you've obviously seen from a distance the 3 months that Amrim has had. I know that Mark was on ESPN after the Fulham game saying that United have got worse. Is that an opinion that you would agree with? Have you seen anything in the last 3 months on the pitch to suggest that Ineos have got that managerial appointment right and Amrim is the right man to take United forward?
Look, I think it says a lot about just the state of the world these days, actually, that, he talks a good game, and that actually can take you an awfully long way, He comes across as likeable. I think he's maybe almost too honest in some of his press conferences. He's got a charm about him. I think if I was a player, I'd want to play for him. I can see that, It's hard. I mean, on the pitch, I remember when they played at Spurs, you could see the patterns. You could see what they were trying to do. Mazraoui was coming in off the right. They were trying to find him in that little pocket, that sort of 10 pocket. And then he was switching play to the left wing, and then the left wing was trying to deliver it into the box. They tried that pattern of play about 3 or 4 times. A couple of times it came off. And you could sort of say, okay, I can see the patterns now. I can start to see what they're trying to do. But they're flashes, aren't they, guys? I mean, they're moments in games. They're not a club. They're not a team that you watch and you think they're really exerting sustained pressure on anyone, apart from perhaps when they just go for broke near the end of games or they're trying to gamble. But they don't ever have control of matches. And that, I think, is a problem. And people talk a lot about this system. Has anybody watched Crystal Palace recently? That's how to play 3-4-2-1. That's exactly what Glasner's doing at Crystal Palace, and they look really good. And people talk about, players who maybe are not suited to the system. Mateta playing up front in that system, Eze, Ismail Sarr. I mean, they all have potential in those roles, but they've proven adaptable. And yet, I'm not suggesting that Glasner's a better manager than Amrim. I'm just simply saying that what he's done with a much more modest squad and obviously a smaller budget is to sort of say, well, I'm going to take this group and I'm going to change them to 3 at the back and I'm going to show how they can do it.
Those players individually you mentioned are probably better than what United have got. You know what I mean? Crystal Palace have probably got a better squad right now than Man United.
Yeah. I mean, one other thing I wanted to ask, actually, because just from talking about this from afar, is about the stadium. And I know we've sort of covered this, but these feasibility reports, they obviously take time, and it's not an easy decision to decide whether you're going to spend £1 billion on the stadium. But the financial picture that you're talking about, Mark, I mean, is this the real reason why this stadium decision is taking place at the end of the season? Because it is simply a case of, we don't really know how we're going to pay for this. And if we're not in any European competition, if the 100 million black hole suddenly materialises, is that the difference between a new stadium and a rebuild, or, a rebuild or a new stadium and nothing?
I'm not sure it's connected, to be honest. I don't think they join the dots on that. I think that they really want somebody to help pay for the stadium. They look at Man City and West Ham having had basically free stadiums, or I think they're both kind of, peppercorn rent is the phrase, isn't it? It costs them nothing. They're owned by the taxpayer. And you look at Tottenham and Arsenal and Everton to a lesser extent, the cost that it's involved building those new stadiums. Arsenal are still probably paying for it, really, 20 years on. Tottenham will be paying for a while, Everton will be paying for a while. So they don't want to be in a situation where they've got all the debt off, the football debt, which relates to the Glazers, and more debt. So I think they're trying to do it on a kind of a dual track, but I don't see how it works. And I think they have to convince people they can get it right in a football sense first, that they know what they're doing before somebody will put some money to invest in a stadium. But a stadium is an opportunity to some people. It's, the money they can make from a stadium, if they can do it properly, it is an opportunity for somebody to invest in. But if that's going to be the case, they might have to look at, the Glazers or Ineos selling more to private equity to get more money in, because I don't see any other way out of it.
Just to wrap up then, there are a lot of United fans who will listen to this and be very worried about United's future. They've already kind of made their mind up that there isn't much optimism around the club at the moment. If you were to look into your crystal ball, what does United's year look like? How bad could it get?
How bad could it get? It's pretty bad right now, isn't it? They're going to finish the lowest league position. Apparently, they're on course to be the lowest league position since they were relegated in 1974. This is lower than anything Fergie had in his bad days. They're out of the Cups. The Europa League is still possible, but I don't see them getting past Sociedad or Tottenham or other clubs that are in there. I think that's... So, it looks really, really grim. I think Amorim will survive, but I think he's going to survive limping on, because I don't, like you said before, Rob, I don't think they're going to give him the players that he wants and needs. And even if they had all the will in the world to give him the players that he wants, they haven't got the money to do it unless they win the Europa League, to get in the Champions League. But that's kind of fantasy land, isn't it?
Well, Ineos will hope not.